I got fired by email, right as I was scattering my mother's ashes in the Swiss Alps. No phone call, no warning. And while they thought I'd retreated forever, I left behind the one thing they couldn't control. The truth, encrypted. As for me, I just needed to sit back in my lounge chair and... Wait, my name is Erin Caldwell. And until 3 hours ago, I was the lead security systems engineer at Orion Dynamics, a fintech company that processed billions in sensitive financial data for Fortune 500 clients. At 35, I'd built their entire backup infrastructure from scratch, a beautiful web of redundancy that spanned 3 continents. I was good at my job. Too good, apparently. The morning mist clung to the Matterhorn as I stood at the edge of a crystalline lake, my mother's urn heavy in my hands. She'd always wanted to see Switzerland but never made it out of Ohio. Cancer took her before she could cash in her retirement savings for that dream trip. So here I was, making good on a promise whispered in a hospice room that smelled of antiseptic and false hope. The hotel concierge had hiked up the trail behind me, his breath forming clouds in the thin mountain air. Strange, I thought, watching him approach. I'd specifically requested no interruptions during my stay. Miss Caldwell, he panted, holding out a folded piece of paper. The hotel. Urgent message. They say check email immediately. My hands trembled as I took the note, not from the cold, but from a premonition that twisted in my gut like a living thing. The paper had 4 words typed in courier font, check your email, now. I finished what I'd come to do first. Mom deserved that much. The ashes caught on the wind, dancing across the water like silver dust. And I whispered goodbye to the only person who'd ever truly believed in me. Then I hiked back down to the hotel, my phone buzzing incessantly in my pocket like an angry wasp. 47 notifications. My personal email, which only 6 people at Orion Dynamics had access to. The subject line of the most recent one made my blood run cold. Termination of employment, effective immediately. I sat on my hotel bed, still in my hiking boots, and read Mason Roth's email 3 times. Our CEO had always been a cold bastard, but this was surgical in its cruelty. No explanation beyond restructuring and elimination of redundant positions. Redundant. After I'd built them a fortress of data protection that had saved their asses during 3 major breach attempts, the termination was effective immediately. My corporate accounts would be deactivated within the hour. They'd already processed my final paycheck, minus the vacation days I was currently using to bury my mother. How efficient of them. I didn't react. Didn't throw my phone or scream or cry. Instead, I opened my laptop and smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that would have made Mason very nervous if he'd seen it, because Mason Roth, in all his Wharton-educated wisdom, had forgotten one crucial detail about the system I'd designed. I was the only one with root access to the backup nodes. All of them. They'd just fired their single point of failure. Let me paint you a picture of Orion Dynamics data architecture, the one I'd spent 3 years perfecting. Imagine a spider web spanning the globe, each strand a fiber optic cable carrying terabytes of financial data every second. At the center sat our primary servers in New York, humming away in a climate-controlled room that cost more per square foot than most Manhattan penthouses. But the real beauty lay in the mirrors, backup servers in Dublin, Santiago, and my masterpiece, a black site node in Nuuk, Greenland, powered entirely by geothermal energy and protected by both physical isolation and encryption so complex it would take the NSA years to crack. When I'd proposed this distributed system, the board had balked at the cost. Redundancy is waste, Mason had said, tapping his Mont Blanc against the conference table. We need efficiency, not paranoia. I'd won that battle by demonstrating how one ransomware attack on our competitors had cost them $47 million, and their reputation. Suddenly, my paranoia looked like prudence. But when came time to staff the system, Mason's cost-cutting instincts kicked in again. We don't need a whole team for backup management, he'd decided. You built it, Caldwell. You can run it. So I did. Every encryption key, every root password, every backdoor and failsafe, they all lived in my head and in a hardware security module that I wore on a chain around my neck. Company policy said we needed redundant access, but policy was just paper when weighed against quarterly profits. I opened my terminal and typed a simple command. The screen filled with green text as I connected to each backup node in sequence. Dublin online, Santiago online, Nuuk online, and waiting for instructions. My corporate email pinged one last time before dying. The automated IT system informing me that my access had been revoked. I watched the notification fade and laughed. Actually laughed. Because they'd just locked themselves out of their own house while I still held all the spare keys. The next few hours would be critical. They'd expect me to rage, to lash out, to do something stupid that would justify their decision to fire me. They'd probably already briefed their lawyers, prepared for a wrongful termination suit or even sabotage. But I wasn't going to give them what they expected. I was going to give them exactly what they deserved: absolute professionalism in the face of their absolute stupidity. I ordered room service, fondue, and a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's rent, and settled in to craft the most courteous, helpful, and utterly devastating email of my career. My response to the termination email was a masterpiece of corporate passive aggression. I'd learned long ago that the best revenge isn't served cold. It's served with such impeccable professionalism that your enemies choke on their own guilt. Or in Mason's case, their own arrogance. "Dear Mr. Roth," I began, fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced precision. "I acknowledge receipt of your termination notice dated today. While I am surprised by the timing, given that I am currently on approved bereavement leave, I respect the company's decision and wish Orion Dynamics continued success." I paused, sipping the excellent Chiselas white I'd ordered. The Swiss really did know their wine. Outside my window, the Alps glowed pink in the setting sun, indifferent to the corporate drama unfolding in their shadow. In the interest of ensuring a smooth transition, I've compiled comprehensive documentation of all systems under my purview. Please find attached. What followed was a list that would make any competent IT manager weep. 37 documents detailing every aspect of the backup system, from network topology to disaster recovery procedures. Each file was perfectly formatted, meticulously detailed, and completely, utterly useless without the access credentials I didn't include. I wasn't sabotaging anything. Every piece of information they needed was there, laid out like a roadmap. I even included helpful diagrams and step-by-step procedures for routine maintenance. What I didn't include were the passwords, the encryption keys, or the biometric data needed to actually implement any of it. I remain available for consultation during the standard 2-week transition period, I concluded. Though I note that my corporate email has already been deactivated, you may reach me at this personal address. I trust the team will have no difficulties managing the infrastructure in my absence. I hit send and closed my laptop with a satisfied click. Then I waited. The silence that followed was deafening. No frantic phone calls, no apologetic emails, no requests for clarification. Just nothing, which told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't even assigned anyone to take over my responsibilities before firing me. They'd cut off their nose to spite their face, and now they were trying to figure out how to breathe. I spent the next 3 days doing exactly what I'd come to Switzerland to do, mourning my mother and finding peace in the mountains. I hiked trails that would have challenged someone half my age, ate too much chocolate, and slept like the dead in my obscenely expensive hotel room. Every morning, I'd check my email, find nothing from Orion, and smile a little wider. On day 4, the dam broke. The first crack came from Dylan Frost, a junior developer who'd been hired 6 months ago. His email was trying so hard to be casual, it practically bled desperation through the screen. "Hey, Aaron, hope Switzerland is treating you well. Quick question, having some trouble accessing the Dublin mirror. Says my credentials are invalid, must be a glitch. Could you shoot me the root password when you get a chance? Thanks." I archived it without responding. 2 hours later, another email, this time from Sarah in IT. someone I'd actually liked before all this went down. Aaron, I'm so sorry about what happened. It's not right. But we're in a bit of a bind here. The Santiago server is showing some errors and we can't run diagnostics without admin access. I know you're on leave, but could you help us out for old time's sake? For old time's sake. Like the 3 years I'd spent building their empire counted for nothing more than nostalgia. I archived that one too. By evening, the emails were coming fast and furious. The tone had shifted from casual to concerned to barely concealed panic. The Greenland node had gone into lockdown mode, a security feature I'd implemented for exactly this scenario. Without the proper biometric authentication, it would stay locked tighter than Fort Knox. I opened a new bottle of wine and raised a toast to my mother's photo on the nightstand. You always said they'd miss me when I was gone. Mom. You just never specified how quickly. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number that I recognized as Mason's personal cell. Call me. Urgent. I deleted it and turned my phone off. Tomorrow I was touring a chocolate factory. Priorities, after all. By the time I returned from the chocolate factory tour, and yes, it was as delightful as it sounds, my personal email had transformed into a digital crisis center, 63 new messages, each more desperate than the last. The subject lines alone told a story of escalating panic. Quick clarification needed. Urgent system access required. Critical backup failures across all nodes. Please respond. SEC audit files inaccessible. That last one made me pause. SEC audit files. I'd almost forgotten about those. Orion Dynamics had a quarterly audit coming up in 2 weeks, and all the supporting documentation was stored exclusively on the backup servers. The primaries only held current data. The historical records they'd need to prove compliance lived in my mirrors. I opened the email from our Chief Technology Officer, Marcus Webb. He'd never liked me. Probably because I'd corrected him in front of the board when he'd tried to claim credit for my distributed architecture design. His message was a masterpiece of barely controlled rage dressed up as professional concern. Min Caldwell, he wrote, foregoing any pretense of friendliness. Your failure to provide transition materials has put the company at significant risk. Our new systems administrator is unable to access critical infrastructure. This borders on sabotage. Respond immediately, or we will be forced to pursue legal action. Legal action? How adorable. I pulled up the email I'd sent on termination day, the one with 37 attached documents and a clear statement of my availability for consultation. Then I checked my inbox. Not a single response to that email. Not one question, clarification request, or even acknowledgement that they'd received it. The new systems administrator he mentioned had to be Dylan. Sweet, eager Dylan who'd once asked me if we really needed to test our backups monthly because wasn't that what redundancy was for? They'd handed my life's work to a kid who thought RAID arrays were a type of insect spray. I decided it was time for another response. Not to Marcus, never give ammunition to someone making legal threats, but to poor Dylan, who was probably pulling his hair out trying to understand my documentation. Hi Dylan, I typed, keeping my tone warm and helpful. I received your earlier email about the Dublin mirror access issues. As outlined in document 14B of the transition materials I provided, the mirror servers operate on a rotating credential system with biometric confirmation. The passwords you're entering are likely from the deprecated system we sunset last quarter. I'd be happy to walk you through the current authentication process. My consultation rate is $500 per hour, with a 4-hour minimum. Please have HR forward the appropriate contracts, and I'll gladly schedule a call at your earliest convenience. Best of luck with the transition. I hit send and immediately received an out-of-office response. Dylan Frost is currently unavailable due to a medical emergency. Stress-induced, no doubt. Poor kid. The flood of emails had slowed to a trickle, which meant one of two things. Either they'd figured it out unlikely, or they were regrouping for a different approach probable. I decided to do some investigating of my own. Orion Dynamics client portal was still accessible to the public, and I logged in using credentials from a shell company I'd set up years ago for penetration testing. What I found there made me whistle low and long. Service status degraded, estimated resolution time unknown. They were hiding the full scope of the problem from their clients, but the signs were everywhere. Response times had tripled. Data refresh rates were crawling. The real-time financial feeds that were our bread and butter were lagging by hours instead of milliseconds. Without the backup servers to distribute the load, the primaries were choking on their own data. It was like watching a snake try to swallow an elephant, painful, slow, and ultimately doomed to failure. My phone rang. Mason's number again. I let it go to voicemail and was rewarded with 2 minutes of barely coherent threats wrapped in legalese. The word sabotage featured prominently, as did criminal charges and full extent of the law. I transcribed the voicemail carefully, adding it to a growing folder on my laptop labeled Evidence. Because while Mason was busy threatening me, I was documenting every single misstep, every ignored email, every sign that they'd fired me without a succession plan and were now trying to blame me for their own incompetence. The Swiss employment lawyer I'd consulted that morning, because I might be on vacation, but I wasn't stupid, had been very interested in the timeline. They terminated you while on approved bereavement leave, she'd asked, her eyes lighting up with the particular glee lawyers get when they smell a slam-dunk case. And then failed to respond to your transition communications. Please, tell me you have documentation. I had documentation. Oh, did I have documentation? As the sun set over Lake Geneva, I made myself a cup of tea and settled in to watch Orion Dynamics' stock price. It had been sliding all day, down 3% on technical difficulties they were trying to pass off as routine maintenance. Tomorrow, someone would notice that the audit files were inaccessible. Next week, when the SEC came calling, they'd have to explain why 3 years of compliance data had vanished into the digital ether. And Mason Roth would learn that when you fire the person holding your entire house of cards together, you'd better have a backup plan. Too bad I'd been the backup plan. The 5th day brought a new player to the game. I was enjoying breakfast on my hotel balcony, fresh croissants and jam with alpine views that belonged on a postcard, when my phone buzzed with an email from Audrey Myers, senior partner at Harrington, Klein & Associates. Now this was interesting. HK&A didn't handle employment law, they were Orion's attack dogs for intellectual property and corporate espionage cases. If they were reaching out, it meant Mason had escalated beyond threats and into actual legal maneuvering. Dear Ms. Caldwell. The email began with surgical precision. We represent Orion Dynamics in the matter of your recent separation from the company. It has come to our attention that critical infrastructure passwords and security credentials remain in your possession. We must stress that these are proprietary assets belonging to Orion Dynamics. I nearly choked on my coffee. Proprietary assets. The passwords I'd created, stored in the security module I'd purchased with my own credit card because procurement had dragged their feet for 6 months. The email continued with thinly veiled threats about trade secret theft and competitive disadvantage, culminating in a demand that I immediately provide all access credentials and authentication materials or face civil and criminal prosecution. I screenshot the email and forwarded it to my own lawyer, along with a note, "They're getting desperate. How should I respond?" Her reply came within minutes. "Don't let them sweat." So I did. I spent the morning at a spa, getting a hot stone massage while Orion's infrastructure continued its slow-motion collapse. The massage therapist commented on the tension in my shoulders, and I laughed. If only she knew that 3,000 miles away. An entire IT department was probably ready to commit ritual suicide. By afternoon, the public facade was cracking. Tech blogs had picked up on Orion's extended maintenance window, and speculation was running wild. When a fintech company processing billions in daily transactions goes dark for more than 24 hours, people notice. My LinkedIn notifications were going crazy. Former colleagues, industry contacts, even a few competitors reaching out with variations of, "Hey, heard you left Orion. Everything okay?" The smart ones were already connecting the dots between my departure and the company's sudden technical difficulties. Then came the masterstroke of corporate theater. Orion released a press statement that was breathtaking in its audacity. Orion Dynamics is currently undergoing a planned system optimization as part of our commitment to providing best-in-class service to our clients. Recent personnel changes have allowed us to reimagine our technical infrastructure under new leadership. We expect all systems to return to full capacity within 48 hours. Personnel changes, new leadership. They were trying to spin my firing as some kind of strategic innovation. The best part, they just put a 48-hour timer on their own incompetence. In 2 days, when systems were still down, they'd have to explain why their optimization had failed. I pulled up my document folder and added the press release to my evidence collection. My lawyer was going to have a field day with this. They'd publicly admitted to making personnel changes that directly impacted their technical infrastructure, right after firing their lead systems engineer without cause or proper transition planning. Sarah from IT tried calling again. This time she left a voicemail. And she sounded like she'd been crying. "Aaron, please, I know you're angry. And you have every right to be. But this is bigger than Mason's ego now. We have client data at risk. If you ever cared about the work we did together, please help us." I felt a twinge of sympathy for Sarah. She was a good engineer, stuck in an impossible situation because of leadership stupidity. But caring about the work and enabling Mason's behavior were two different things. They'd created this crisis, they could solve it. Or not, as the case seemed to be. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding. I logged into my monitoring dashboard. Not Orion's systems, those credentials were long dead, but my personal monitoring setup. Because of course I'd built redundancies into my redundancies. I wasn't just paranoid, I was professionally paranoid. What I saw made me sit up straight. The Greenland node wasn't just in lockdown, it was actively rejecting connection attempts. Hundreds of them, coming from Orion's IP addresses. Someone was running brute force attacks against my security, trying to crack their way in through sheer computational power. The attacks were amateur hour, dictionary passwords, common combinations, even laughably, password 123. But what they lacked in sophistication, they made up for in desperation. The logs showed attempts every few seconds, round the clock. They'd probably hired some gray hat hackers to break into their own systems. I pulled up the node's configuration file and smiled at a particular line of code I'd added 2 years ago. A little insurance policy, I'd called it then. After 500 failed access attempts, the system would begin increasing its encryption complexity exponentially. By my calculations, they'd hit that threshold about 6 hours ago. Which meant that right now, somewhere in Orion's offices, someone was watching their decryption estimates climb from hours to days to years, to heat death of the universe. I poured myself a glass of wine and made a decision. Tomorrow, I'd fly home. Not because they needed me, but because the real fireworks were about to begin. The SEC had announced a surprise audit of 3 major fintech firms, moving up their timeline by a week. Guess which company was first on their list? The flight back from Zurich gave me 9 hours to review everything that had transpired. I'd switched my phone to airplane mode, not to avoid the cascade of increasingly frantic messages, but to preserve them. Every email, every voicemail, every legal threat. They painted a picture of corporate incompetence so staggering that even I was impressed by its scope. By the time I landed at JFK, the Whisper network was in full swing. The tech industry might span the globe, but it's a small world when it comes to gossip. And the story of Orion's meltdown was too juicy to keep quiet. My Uber driver was still loading my luggage when my phone exploded with notifications, texts, WhatsApp messages, Signal chats. Everyone wanted to know if the rumors were true. Had I really been fired mid-bereavement? Had Orion really locked themselves out of their own systems? Was Mason Roth really telling investors it was all part of a planned upgrade? I ignored most of them, but one message stopped me cold. It was from James Morrison, a former Orion board member who'd retired last year. "Aaron, heard about the situation. Mason's telling the board you went rogue. Mental health issues from your mother's death. Says you deliberately sabotaged systems before leaving. Call me." So that was their play. Paint me as the unstable, grieving daughter who'd lost her mind and turned vindictive. It was cruel, sexist, and exactly what I'd expected from Mason. It also revealed just how desperate they'd become. I texted James back, "Thanks for the heads up. Have full documentation of all communications. Their lawyers already threatening me for not providing passwords they failed to request during termination. We'll let legal handle, but appreciate you reaching out." His response was immediate. "Good, never liked Mason. Keep records of everything. Board meeting Thursday." Thursday, 3 days away. The same day as the SEC audit. I'd barely settled into my apartment when my lawyer called. "Aaron, I need you to see this. Check your email." I opened my laptop to find a formal cease and desist letter from HK&A, along with a civil complaint they'd apparently filed that morning. The accusations were breathtaking in their scope: theft of trade secrets, corporate sabotage, intentional infliction of emotional distress that one actually made me laugh, and something called breach of fiduciary duty. "They're throwing everything at the wall," my lawyer said, and I could hear her smile through the phone. This is what panic looks like in legal form. They're trying to establish a narrative before the SEC gets involved. What's our response? We counterfile wrongful termination, discrimination, defamation, and hostile work environment. I've already drafted the complaint, but Aaron, I need you to understand something. Once we file, this goes public. Your name will be attached to this. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my mother, how she'd spent 30 years at a company that promoted less qualified men over her again and again, how she'd smiled and taken it because she needed the health insurance, how she'd told me on her deathbed to never let them make me small. "File it," I said. The next morning, I woke to find my LinkedIn inbox flooded with messages. The legal filing had hit the tech news sites overnight, and the narrative was already forming. "Female engineer fired during mother's funeral accused of sabotage," read one headline. Another was more direct. "Orion Dynamics in crisis, did they fire the wrong person?" But the most interesting development came from an unexpected source. Someone inside Orion was leaking documents to TechCrunch. Internal emails showing the panic after my termination. Frantic Slack messages about the inaccessible servers. Even a recording of Mason telling the leadership team to control the narrative about my mental state. I had my suspicions about the source. Sarah had gone quiet after her last voicemail, and the leaked documents carefully avoided implicating the IT team while thoroughly exposing upper management's incompetence. My lawyer called again that afternoon. "Aaron, I just got off the phone with HK&A. They want to meet today. They want me to give them the passwords." Of course they do. But here's the interesting part. They're offering a settlement, full severance, plus a significant sum for consulting services. All you have to do is sign an NDA and provide the access credentials. How significant? She named a figure that would have paid off my student loans and bought a nice condo. 2 years ago, I might have taken it. But this wasn't about money anymore. Tell them no. But make sure they understand I'm happy to provide the credentials through proper channels. They can submit a formal request for technical transition assistance, acknowledging that they failed to do so during my termination. Standard consulting rates apply. You realize they'll never do that. It would be admitting fault. I'm counting on it. That evening, as I sat in my apartment reviewing the latest batch of leaked emails, my doorbell rang. I checked the security camera to find a FedEx delivery requiring signature. The package was from Orion Dynamics HR department. Inside was a formal letter demanding the return of all company property, specifically mentioning the hardware security module, the one I'd bought myself. The letter gave me 24 hours to comply or face additional legal action. I photographed the letter, the original receipt for the security module, and the email chain where I'd tried to get Orion to reimburse me for it. They'd refused, saying it wasn't approved equipment. Then I sent everything to my lawyer with a single word. "Really?" Her response was equally brief. "They're getting desperate. This is good." Good was a relative term. My reputation was taking hits from Mason's whisper campaign, and the stress was starting to show. I'd found 3 gray hairs that morning, and my appetite had vanished somewhere over the Atlantic. But every time I wavered, I remembered my mother's words. They'll try to make you feel guilty for being good at your job. Don't let them. As Thursday approached, the pressure intensified. Orion's stock had dropped 12% on technical difficulties and leadership concerns. The SEC had formally announced their audit, and somewhere in Manhattan, Mason Roth was learning that when you build your house on someone else's foundation, you'd better make sure they don't take it with them when they leave. The best part, I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd simply stopped doing the job they'd fired me from. The fact that they couldn't function without me wasn't sabotage. It was evidence. Thursday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn morning that made New York feel like a movie set. I dressed carefully, professional blazer, understated jewelry, the kind of outfit that said competent engineer rather than disgruntled ex-employee. If I was going to be painted as a villain, I'd at least look the part of a very put-together one. My lawyer had advised me to stay home, avoid any appearance of involvement with Orion's current troubles. But I had a lunch date with James Morrison, and I wasn't about to miss the opportunity to hear about the board meeting firsthand. We met at a discreet bistro in Tribeca, the kind of place where Wall Street power brokers made deals over $30 salads. James looked tired, stress etched into the lines around his eyes. "It's a bloodbath," he said without preamble, sliding into the booth across from me. The SEC showed up at 8 a.m. with a team of 12 auditors. They want 3 years of compliance data, transaction logs, audit trails, everything. And the backup servers are still inaccessible. Dylan, that's the kid they got to replace you. He actually threw up in a wastebasket during the meeting. Mason tried to blame it on food poisoning, but everyone knew. I sipped my water carefully. What's the board's position? Divided. Half want to negotiate with you immediately, get the passwords at any cost. The other half are backing Mason, convinced they can break into the systems or restore from other sources. He laughed bitterly. Other sources? As if you didn't design the only reliable backup system they had. They could restore from tape, I offered, knowing full well what his response would be. What tape? Mason cut the tape backup budget 2 years ago. Said it was redundant with your system in place. James shook his head. The irony is killing me. They fired the redundancy expert and kept the redundancy. Our food arrived, but neither of us had much appetite. James pushed his salmon around his plate while filling me in on the morning's disasters. The SEC had given Orion 48 hours to produce the required documentation. Without it, they faced fines that started at $10 million and went up from there, plus potential criminal charges if the commission suspected deliberate noncompliance. Mason's trying to float a theory that you corrupted the data before leaving, James said, but the security logs show no access from your credentials after the termination email. He can't explain that away. Because I didn't access anything, I said simply. I haven't touched their system since they revoked my access. Everything that's happening is a result of their own actions, or inaction. I know that. The smart board members know that. But Mason's got them scared. He's talking about cyber terrorism, about making an example of you to prevent other employees from holding companies hostage. I nearly laughed at that. Cyber terrorism. Because I'd refused to work for free after being fired, the mental gymnastics required to reach that conclusion were Olympic level. My phone buzzed. Sarah from IT. Texting from a number I didn't recognize. They're bringing in a team from Black Hat Security to crack the encryption. Thought you should know. Black Hat Security. I knew them by reputation. Gray market hackers who specialized in recovery services for companies that had lost access to their own systems. They were good, but they weren't miracle workers. The encryption I'd implemented would take them years to crack. And that was assuming the exponential complexity increase hadn't kicked in. There's something else, James said, lowering his voice. The FBI reached out this morning. Apparently, some of Orion's clients have filed complaints about inaccessible funds. If customer money is affected, he didn't need to finish. If customer funds were impacted, this went from corporate incompetence to potential federal crime. And guess who they'd try to blame? I excused myself and called my lawyer from the restaurant's vestibule. How worried should I be about the FBI? Not at all. I've already been in touch with their financial crimes division, explained the situation, provided documentation. They're actually more interested in why Orion had a single point of failure for critical financial systems. Turns out that might violate several regulations. So Mason's threats are going to backfire spectacularly. Aaron, I need you to listen carefully. In the next 24 hours, Orion is going to get very desperate. They might try to approach you directly, outside of legal channels. Do not engage. Do not respond. Let me handle everything. I agreed and returned to find James paying the check. I have to get back, he said apologetically. Emergency board meeting at 2. But, Aaron, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. You deserved better than this. As I walked home, my phone lit up with news alerts. Orion's stock was in free fall, down 18% and trading halted. Tech reporters were swarming the story, and my name was trending on Twitter. The narrative was splitting into two camps: those who saw me as a saboteur holding a company hostage, and those who recognized the situation for what it was: a catastrophic management failure. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding. I checked my work email archive. Not Orion's systems, but my personal backup of every email I'd sent or received during my employment. 3 years of communications, all time-stamped and authenticated. What I found there made me pause. Buried in the technical discussions and project updates were dozens of emails where I'd warned about the single point of failure. Messages to Mason, to the board, to anyone who would listen, explaining the risks of having one person control critical access. This configuration leaves us vulnerable. I'd written in one email dated 18 months ago. If something happens to me, the company needs a break glass procedure for system access. Mason's response had been typically dismissive. Your concerns are noted, but the cost of implementing redundant access controls isn't justified by the minimal risk. Focus on maintaining uptime, not creating hypothetical problems. Hypothetical problems. I forwarded the entire email chain to my lawyer with a note: might want to add gross negligence to our countersuit. As midnight approached, I sat in my apartment watching the city lights flicker across the East River. Somewhere in Orion's offices, teams of engineers and hackers were battling against mathematics itself, trying to crack encryption that got stronger with every failed attempt. The SEC's deadline was ticking down, and Mason Roth was learning a lesson that every engineer knows by heart. You can't fix a single point of failure after it's already failed. My mother would have loved this, not the conflict, but the poetic justice of it all. They'd tried to make me small, disposable, replaceable. Instead, they discovered that some things and some people are irreplaceable. Tomorrow would bring new threats, new legal maneuvers, new attempts to shift blame. But tonight, I opened a bottle of wine and raised a glass to the empty air. Here's to redundancy. Mom, turns out I wasn't so redundant after all. Friday morning arrived with the kind of explosive revelation that makes corporate lawyers reach for their heart medication. I was brewing my first cup of coffee when my phone lit up with a call from my lawyer. Aaron, are you sitting down? Should I be? The FBI raided Orion's offices at 6 a.m. White-collar crime division. They're seizing servers, documents, everything. I sank into my kitchen chair, coffee forgotten. Because of the system access? No. Well, partly. But Aaron, when the SEC couldn't get the audit files, they started looking at the primary servers, the ones that are still accessible. They found discrepancies, major discrepancies. My mind raced through possibilities. Data inconsistencies were common in financial systems, but for the FBI to get involved, what kind of discrepancies? The kind that suggests systematic fraud, phantom transactions, duplicate billing, shell company transfers. The preliminary report suggests someone's been cooking the books for years. I felt the blood drain from my face. The backup servers didn't just store redundant data, they stored historical data. Unedited, unfiltered, raw transaction logs that would show every manipulation, every deleted entry, every fraudulent adjustment. They think I knew, I said, the realization hitting like a physical blow. They think that's why I'm keeping the servers locked. Did you know? No, I never looked at the transaction data itself. That wasn't my job. I just maintained the infrastructure. But even as I said it, memories surfaced. Odd requests to purge certain backup sets. Pressure to reduce retention periods. Mason's insistence that we didn't need such comprehensive historical data. It doesn't matter what you knew then, my lawyer said firmly. What matters is that you have the evidence now. The FBI wants to talk to you. Today, I spent the morning in my lawyer's office, surrounded by federal agents who treated me with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Chen, laid out their problem with clinical precision. Orion Dynamics processes over $2 billion in transactions daily. Our forensic accountants have identified patterns suggesting up to $300 million in fraudulent activity over the past 3 years. But we can only see the current data. The historical records that would prove systematic fraud are on my backup servers, I finished. Can you access them? I chose my words carefully. I have the technical ability to access them. Whether I have the legal right to do so is a different question. Agent Chen leaned forward. Ms. Caldwell, if you're withholding evidence of federal crimes, my lawyer intervened smoothly. My client has been wrongfully terminated and is currently being sued by Orion for maintaining passwords to systems she built. She's happy to cooperate with federal authorities, but we need assurances that she won't face prosecution for accessing systems her former employer claims she's locked them out of. The negotiation that followed was swift. Within 2 hours, I had written immunity for any actions related to the backup systems. In exchange, I would provide the FBI with complete access to the historical data. I pulled out my laptop and the hardware security module I'd worn around my neck for 3 years. Before I do this, I said, I need you to understand something. Once I unlock these servers, Orion will have access too. They'll see everything you see. They'll have time to destroy evidence, create explanations, muddy the waters. Agent Chen smiled grimly. We've seized their primary servers and frozen all access. They won't be destroying anything. I connected to the Greenland node first. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced ease, entering passwords I'd never written down, biometric data I'd never shared, one by one. The backup servers came online, their status lights flipping from red to green on my monitoring dashboard. How long to download everything? Agent Chen asked. From Greenland, about 6 hours for the full dataset. Dublin and Santiago will be faster. Do it. As the downloads began, I felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. For 5 days, I'd been painted as the villain, the disgruntled employee holding her company hostage. Now, I was potentially the key witness in a federal fraud investigation. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. News channels reporting FBI raid. Mason taken out in handcuffs. Please tell me you're okay. I didn't respond. There would be time for that later. The data transfer completed just after sunset. Agent Chen's team dove into the files like sharks scenting blood, their excited chatter filling the conference room. Within an hour, they'd found what they were looking for. Jesus Christ, one analyst whispered, staring at his screen. They weren't just cooking the books. They were running an entire phantom operation. Look at these shell companies. They all trace back to accounts controlled by senior management. Including the CEO, Agent Chen asked. Especially the CEO. Mason Roth's signature is on every fraudulent transfer authorization. I thought about all the times Mason had talked about efficiency, about cutting costs, about maximizing shareholder value. Apparently, he'd been maximizing his own value at shareholders' expense. There's more. Another analyst said, the audit logs show attempts to delete this data from the backup servers starting 6 months ago. All failed because only I had deletion privileges. I finished. Mason tried to get me to change that policy multiple times. I refused, said it was a security risk. Agent Chen looked at me with something approaching respect. You saved evidence of a $300 million fraud scheme. Whether you knew it or not, your paranoia about security just took down one of the biggest financial fraud operations we've seen in years. As I left the federal building that night, My phone exploded with notifications. The story had broken wide open. Orion Dynamics CEO arrested in massive fraud scheme. Whistleblower engineer exposes financial crime ring. The single point of failure that saved the FBI's case. Whistleblower. They were calling me a whistleblower now, even though I'd had no idea what was hiding in those servers. I'd just been doing my job, protecting data with the kind of redundancy and security that Mason had mocked as excessive. My lawyer called as I was getting into a cab. Aaron Orion's board just fired Mason and the entire C-suite. They're dropping all legal action against you. And they want to talk about a settlement, a big one. They want me to be quiet about the security failures that enabled this. That's certainly part of it. But, Aaron, the FBI says you're the only reason they have a case. Without your backup systems, without your refusal to delete old data, Mason would have gotten away with it. You're not the villain in this story anymore. You're the hero. Hero? I thought about my mother, about how she'd always told me to document everything, to keep receipts, to never trust anyone who insisted you didn't need backups. She'd been preparing me for this moment my entire life. Tell them I'll think about it, I said. But first, I have a funeral to finish planning. My mom deserves a proper memorial service, one without interruptions. As the cab pulled away from the federal building, I allowed myself a small smile. Mason Roth had fired me for being redundant. Turns out, I was exactly as redundant as I needed to be. A backup system he couldn't delete, storing truths he couldn't erase. The settlement negotiations took place in a glass tower that scraped the Manhattan sky, 30 floors above the chaos Mason Roth had created. I sat across from Orion's interim board, my lawyer beside me, facing down 11 executives who looked like they'd aged a decade in the past week. Ms. Caldwell, the interim CEO began, a silver-haired woman named Patricia Winters who'd been brought in to stop the bleeding. We need to address the elephant in the room. Orion Dynamics is facing complete collapse. Our stock has lost 60% of its value. The SEC fines alone could reach $500 million. Client confidence is shattered. We need stability. And you're the only person who understands our infrastructure well enough to provide it. You fired me, I said simply, via email, while I was burying my mother. Patricia had the grace to wince. Mason Roth's actions were unconscionable. The board extends its deepest apologies and... I don't want apologies. I want acknowledgement. Public acknowledgement that I was wrongfully terminated. That my security protocols saved this company from complete annihilation. And that the redundancy Mason eliminated was actually your safety net. The board members exchanged glances. The general counsel cleared his throat. That kind of public statement could expose us to additional litigation. My lawyer smiled. Gentlemen, ladies, let's be clear. My client holds the keys to evidence in a federal investigation. She's been defamed, wrongfully terminated, and subjected to legal harassment. The statement she's requesting is the least of your concerns. What else do you want? Patricia asked, cutting through the legal posturing. I'd thought about this moment for days. What did I want? Money vindication. My job back, 3 things. First, a public statement as discussed. Second, full severance plus a consulting contract to help transition the systems properly, at my rate, not yours. Third, you implement every single security recommendation I made over the past 3 years, the ones Mason ignored. Your rate being $2,000 per hour. Estimated 200 hours of work. Someone choked on their coffee. Another board member started to object, but Patricia raised a hand. Done. What else? That's it. I don't want my job back. I don't want to work for a company that could let this happen. But I'll ensure a smooth transition because the infrastructure I built deserves better than Dylan's ham-fisted attempts to crack it. The meeting concluded with handshakes and forced smiles. As we waited for the elevator, my lawyer whispered, "You could have asked for millions. They would have paid it." "It's not about the money," I said. "It's about the principle. They need to learn that people aren't redundant. Systems aren't just code. And paranoia isn't a bug. It's a feature." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of federal testimony, system transitions, and media attention I'd never wanted. The FBI investigation expanded, uncovering a network of fraud that reached into other fintech companies. Mason's arrest was just the beginning. By the end, 17 executives across 6 companies were facing federal charges. I spent my days in Orion's offices, training a team of engineers on the systems I'd built. Dylan, to his credit, approached me on the first day with a coffee and an apology. "I'm sorry," he said, looking genuinely miserable. "When they asked me to take over your systems, I should have known something was wrong. The documentation you sent, I couldn't understand half of it." "That's because you weren't qualified," I said, not unkindly. "And that's not your fault. It's theirs, for putting you in an impossible position." We worked together over the following weeks, and I found myself enjoying the teaching aspect. Dylan was eager to learn, quick to admit what he didn't know, and genuinely amazed by the elegance of the distributed backup system. "You built all this alone?" he asked one afternoon, staring at the network topology. "Every line of code, every configuration, every failsafe." Mason called it overkill. The board called it expensive. I called it necessary. "It's beautiful," he said softly. Like a symphony. Everything has a purpose, a rhythm." I smiled, thinking of my mother. She'd been a piano teacher, had always described complex systems in musical terms. "That's exactly what it is. And now you're learning to conduct." The public statement from Orion's board was everything I'd asked for and more. They acknowledged the wrongful termination, praised my security protocols, and announced a complete overhaul of their corporate governance. Tech blogs hailed it as a victory for engineers everywhere. My LinkedIn exploded with connection requests and job offers. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the statement, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a printed email thread I'd never seen before, dated 2 weeks before my termination. "Mason to CFO. Caldwell's getting suspicious about the data purge requests. We need to remove her before the audit. CFO, she has all the access. It'll cripple us. Mason. Only temporarily. Once she's gone, we can blame any missing data on her sabotage. 2 birds, 1 stone." The thread continued, outlining their plan to fire me and use my absence as cover for destroying evidence. They'd never imagined I'd built the system so well that they couldn't access them without me. I forwarded the emails to Agent Chen with a note. "Found this in my mail. Thought you might be interested." Her response was swift. "Where did you get this?" "Anonymous source. But I'd guess someone with access to executive email archives. Someone who knew where the bodies were buried." I had my suspicions about the source. The interim board had been conducting their own investigation, and Patricia Winters struck me as the type who believed in thorough house cleaning. But some gifts don't need attribution. A month later, I stood in my empty office for the last time. The transition was complete, the systems fully documented and accessible to the qualified team I'd trained. Orion would survive, transformed and chastened. Mason Roth would spend the next decade in federal prison. "You could stay," Patricia said from the doorway. "Name your position, your salary. The company needs people like you." "No," I said gently. "It needs to learn to value the people it has. I've done my part." That evening, I met Sarah for drinks at a quiet bar in Brooklyn. She'd survived the purge, promoted to head of IT security in the wake of the scandal. "I'm sorry," she said after her second martini, "for not standing up for you when it happened, for being a coward." "You weren't a coward. You were scared. There's a difference." "Is there?" I thought about it. Fear is feeling, cowardice is action, or inaction. You sent me warnings. You leaked those documents. That took courage. She looked up sharply. "How did you?" "Lucky guess," I said, raising my glass. "To redundancy, in systems and in friendships." The next morning, I flew back to Switzerland, not to scatter ashes this time, but to heal. I'd rented a cabin in the Alps for 3 months, far from corporate drama and federal investigations. My new laptop contained a standing offer from a startup doing innovative work in blockchain security. Remote work, equity stake. and a CEO who actually understood technology. As I settled into my window seat, I pulled out my mother's journal, the one I'd found while cleaning out her apartment. The last entry, written in her shaky handwriting days before she died, was addressed to me. My darling Aaron, they'll try to make you small. They'll call you difficult, redundant, replaceable. But you, my love, are the safety net they don't know they need. Never apologize for your thoroughness, your paranoia, your refusal to compromise on what's right. The world needs more engineers like you, not just for the systems you build, but for the integrity you bring to building them. Love, Mom. I closed the journal and watched Manhattan disappear beneath the clouds. Somewhere down there, Orion Dynamics was learning to function without me. The FBI was building cases on evidence I'd preserved. And Mason Roth was discovering that orange jumpsuits really weren't his color. My phone pinged with a news alert. Orion Dynamics stock rebounds on news of governance reform. I turned it off and closed my eyes. The backup systems were secure. The redundancies were in place. And for the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for any of it. My mother would have been proud. 6 months later, I stood before a packed auditorium at DEF Con, the world's largest hacking conference, my talk. The single point of failure that saved a Fortune 500 company had drawn standing room only. Security engineers, system administrators, and IT professionals filled every seat, eager to hear about the Orion Dynamics incident from the horse's mouth. Redundancy, I began, clicking to my first slide, is not waste, it's wisdom. The slide showed a simple diagram, a single key, and a single lock. This is what Orion Dynamics thought they wanted: efficient, clean, minimal overhead. Click. The next slide showed the same lock with no key. This is what they got when they fired their key holder without a backup plan. Nervous laughter rippled through the audience. But the real lesson isn't about access control. I continued. It's about how we value the people who hold our organizations together. The unsexy work of backup systems, documentation, security protocols, these aren't cost centers, they're insurance policies. And the people who build them aren't redundant. They're essential. I spent an hour walking through the technical details of the distributed backup system, the encryption protocols that had frustrated even Black Hat security, and the audit trails that had ultimately exposed a $300 million fraud scheme. But I ended with something more personal. My mother was a piano teacher, I said, pulling up a photo of her at her beloved Steinway. She taught me that every piece of music needs rests, moments of silence that give the notes meaning. In systems architecture, our redundancies are those rests. They seem like nothing is happening, like wasted space. But when the music stops unexpectedly, I clicked to my final slide. Orion's stock price chart showing its catastrophic fall. The silence is deafening. The applause was thunderous. Afterwards, I was mobbed by engineers wanting to share their own stories of being undervalued, of building critical systems only to be deemed expendable. One young woman, probably fresh out of college, waited until the crowd thinned. "Ms. Caldwell," she said hesitantly, "I'm starting my first job next month, back-end systems at a fintech startup. Any advice?" I thought about all the lessons learned, all the battles fought. Document everything, build redundancies into your redundancies, and never, ever be the single point of failure, not because you can't handle it, but because you're too valuable to be expendable. She nodded solemnly and hurried away. As I packed up my laptop, my phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Winters. "Watched your talk online. Brilliant as always. Offer still stands whenever you're ready." I smiled but didn't respond. Orion was healing, implementing every security recommendation I'd made over the years. Their stock had recovered, their systems were stable, and their new culture of transparency was being held up as a model for corporate reform. But that wasn't my world anymore. My world was now a distributed team of 12 engineers building next-generation secure storage solutions. We worked from 6 different countries, collaborated across time zones, and every single person had backup access to every critical system. Our CEO, a former Mozilla engineer named Priya, had hired me with one condition: no single points of failure, not in our systems, not in our team. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd become known for the very thing Orion had fired me for: being irreplaceable. But now I was using that reputation to build systems and teams that could never face the same vulnerability. As I flew back to my new home in Denver, chosen for its mountains and distance from Wall Street, I opened my laptop to find an encrypted message from Agent Chen. The trials were proceeding smoothly, with convictions expected across the board. Mason Roth had pled guilty to avoid a longer sentence, finally admitting what we'd all known: he'd tried to destroy evidence of his fraud by firing the one person who could protect it. "Your testimony has been invaluable," Chen wrote. "But more than that, your system saved hundreds of investors from losing everything. You should be proud." Pride. It was a complicated emotion. I was proud of the systems I'd built, proud of standing my ground, proud of helping bring criminals to justice. But mostly, I was proud that I'd honored my mother's memory by refusing to be made small. That evening, I met my team for our monthly in-person gathering, a tradition Priya insisted on despite our distributed nature. We met at a craft brewery in Denver's Rhino District. 12 engineers from different backgrounds but united in our approach to security and redundancy. To Aaron, Priya raised her glass. "For showing the world that paranoid engineers aren't crazy, we're just early." "To the team," I countered, "for building systems that no single person can break." As we clinked glasses, I thought about the journey from that Swiss hotel room to this Denver brewery. 6 months ago, I'd been the villain in a corporate drama, painted as a vindictive ex-employee holding a company hostage. Now, I was CTO of a startup that had just closed Series A funding with 3 times the expected valuation. One of our junior engineers, clearly a few beers in, asked the question everyone eventually asked: "Do you regret it?" Everything that happened. I considered the question seriously. The stress, the legal battles, the character assassination, the sleepless nights. Had it been worth it? My mother used to say that integrity is what you do when no one's watching. I finally answered. I built those systems with integrity. I maintained them with integrity. And when they fired me, I responded with integrity. The fact that it exposed massive fraud that was just karma working overtime. The conversation moved on to technical challenges and upcoming sprints, but I found myself thinking about redundancy in a broader sense. Orion had tried to eliminate redundancy to save money. Instead, they'd eliminated their safety net and nearly destroyed themselves. Our startup was built on the opposite principle. Every system had backups. Every person had coverage. Every process had documentation. It was more expensive, sure, but it was also anti-fragile. We got stronger under stress rather than shattering. My phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. Dylan, now a senior engineer at Orion, had posted about completing his security certification. His post ended with, "Thanks to Aaron Caldwell for teaching me that redundancy isn't waste, it's wisdom. Best lesson I ever learned." I smiled and liked the post. The kid had come a long way from throwing up in wastebaskets during FBI raids. As the evening wound down and my team dispersed to their various homes, I walked back to my apartment through the crisp Denver air. The mountains loomed in the distance, solid and unchanging, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in their shadow. My mother had never seen these mountains either, but I carried her with me in the systems I built, the integrity I maintained, and the wisdom she'd imparted. Every backup server humming in a data center, every redundant system protecting critical data, every engineer learning to value resilience over efficiency. They were all echoes of her voice, reminding me to save everything. Trust, but verify. And never apologize for being thorough. I reached my apartment and found a package waiting. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting. Inside was a first edition copy of The Phoenix Project, a DevOps classic about systems thinking and resilience. The inscription read, "To the engineer who became her own Phoenix. With admiration, Patricia." I placed the book on my shelf next to my mother's journal and opened my laptop. Tomorrow. We were architecting a new distributed storage system for a healthcare startup. Lives would literally depend on our redundancies, our paranoia, our refusal to create single points of failure. Somewhere, my mother was smiling. I opened a new terminal window and began to code. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting for instructions. This time, I wasn't building alone. This time, redundancy wasn't just a technical specification, it was a core value. Let's build something unbreakable, I whispered to the empty room. And then I got to work.